Hello, I'm Vincent Sekafetz. I'm the director of Bad Influence, and today we're going to be doing a little director's commentary of the movie, which has not come out yet by the time I'm recording this, but I'm excited to see if you all like it. But here we go with the movie. Right away, this whole setup is really kind of unique because I wanted to do something that was different. Originally it started with just a retaining wall and Henry passing by, and then you pan up and then there's Croven's Gate. And I was like, oh, but this just whole opening montage and narration is really kind of basic, just very kind of like a typical Thomas movie. So I wanted to kind of set us off on a different foot to show that this was going to be kind of a different type of Thomas movie. And of course, you see the tree that caught fire, that started the whole fire there in the wintertime, which is, of course, when the epilogue takes place, and I guess when you could guess this whole framing device takes place. The framing device of it being a play is kind of inspired from Julie's idea of the world as like, everything has a part, every prop has a part, every person has a plot, has a point, and then it just worked its way in to kind of draw attention. Yeah. And then this whole sequence, of course, was obviously the exposition part of Sodor, which, I also debated cutting, but I was kind of like, just in case there's anyone out there in a broad audience who needs some reestablishing of the status quo, here it is, One of the first of many Rheneas shots that I just fully color corrected in every shot, right? Because Rheneas, the wooden model, is kind of off pink, kind of a weird pinkish red. So I did my best I could throughout the movie to color correct him to the normal red that he is in the show. And of course, how he's supposed to look, right? And it worked out pretty convincingly. I was pretty happy with it. That Bill and Ben and Aquarium Cars shot is there because I kept trying to write scenes to set up Bill and Ben and the Aquarium Cars, which of course both come into play later with James being tricked by them into taking the Aquarium Cars, and of course that becomes a whole thing later. But those scenes kept getting cut. There was originally one at Brendam Docks, and then eventually one at Knapford to kind of replace the one at Brendam Docks. And then I thought about working that that Knapford scene into the the montage at the end of Act 1, but that didn't happen, so that kind of exists as their very small setup, because I didn't want to just throw Bill and Ben in there out of nowhere, so you kind of get the feeling that they're a little bit playful, a little bit kooky, and the Aquarium Cars are in there too. This opening montage was super fun especially this shot was super fun to film and put together. Of course, that is Brighton Rock by Queen. One of the things that inspired me most with this movie, or just in filmmaking in general, was Edgar Wright, who's my favorite director, who directed Baby Driver, which came out in 2017, and I think I probably saw it in 2018, 2019. It's big into Baby Driver. It definitely influenced this movie a lot. And one of the songs in it is Brighton Rock by Queen, which, of course, this song is. But, it plays a big part in the climax of the movie, but it doesn't really fully envelop the movie the way the rest of the song sequences do. So I kind of wanted to give it a little bit more in this. And, of course, that's Eric Pierre singing Eric Pierre 53 singing the vocals for it, because he's a fantastic singer, right? As well as person, artist, writer, custom maker, whatever. I think he was on like the Quebec Voice or something like that. Anyway, I was very grateful for him to have recorded this version for me, which is very early. He did this in like 2019, so towards the beginning of production, or maybe it was 2020. I don't remember. But he did this very early on. He also made the Origins Black James prop that you see throughout the movie. And I think he also, one of the reasons he's credited for original story is that idea of James going directly from the escape to crashing in the field. So when you see that bit, think of Eric Pierre, because it wouldn't have happened without him, both in the writing department and in the fact that he provided that amazing model to film with. That blue canal boat from earlier is another case of color correction that I think works pretty cool, just because I wanted to do something a little bit different. I only bring it up now because it's the same thing as the Rheneas thing, and someone actually brought up to me at the premiere of the movie, like, I loved the film, blah blah blah, whatever, but I couldn't stop thinking about that blue canal boat. Like, that was the image that stuck in my head, and I thought that was rather. I liked that because it highlighted that someone noticed the color correction. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool, thought that was a fun interaction. This, of course, is the amazing Croven's Gate sheds sets that were all 3D designed, printed, and painted by Alex Townsend, the famous 8, who helped a lot in the production phase of this movie. It really couldn't have happened without these amazing props. It really was the first time really anyone had made an expansive Croven's Gate set on this scale when this was filmed in June 2021. Of course, people have done this set a lot since then with all the little buildings, but it was pretty exciting at the time to be one of the first to have like almost every single building that was on that set in a physical form that we could use with Wooden Railway. However, it was really hot out while we were filming that, so because we used kind of I don't want to say cheap plastic, but the way the plastic is it would absorb the heat from the sun and it would start to melt and bend. So there's a few shots. I don't know if I edited them all out, but you can see the retaining walls kind of bending in the back and melting a little. We had to kind of cover the work shed with a tarp when we weren't filming directly with it, when we were just filming the shed side of it, because otherwise it would just get totally melted and warped, and we were like, oh shit, so that wasn't the most fun to deal with in that set, but it looked good, so I wasn't like, oh, we should have never 3D printed this, we should have just made it out of cardboard or whatever, like the first time I tried to build it in 2019, because would not have looked this good, but challenges come with it. That referral of Ivo as an egg timer by Duke, or no, what Ivo calls Duke as an egg timer, that's a reference to National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, where Clark is like driving on the road and then he sees the car that's taking a while that he doesn't want to pass, and he's like, oh, look at this egg timer, let's get past this egg timer. Which is kind of a very niche reference, but I put it in there. There's a lot of little things in that first Duke and Ivo interaction. There's the 119 years old calm down thing is a direct reference to a conversation that me and Brady had very early on in our relationship, and the why so serious thing I think is like a Joker reference because I thought it was funny. And also like the This Is My Day and We Do was, I think, a Simpsons there's so much packed into the dialogue. Obviously, Gordon just referenced The Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, which is one of my favorite Mark Twain books. I think it might be my favorite Mark Twain book, which I don't know why Gordon knows about it, but good book. This is one of those scenes that we filmed so many times to try to get the lighting right. In the end, it's a combination of a couple different types of lighting. And I think it really highlights how impressive the facial animation is in this movie, just because how much of it just matches and blends with everything. I mean, our Trains filmmakers did such a great job with matching just the demands of this movie. And by demands, I mean just like how much dynamic lighting it has, especially with the fire later on, right? But you can see the makings of it even very early on in these nighttime scenes, which just looks so cool in my opinion. I'm really happy with how they turned out. Yeah, I made that tweet about how Bad Influence is, an excuse to just show off my favorite movie soundtracks, and that's true. There's a lot of Cars 2 music here, but even more so is this prevalence of the Batman score by Danny Elfman. I was a huge fan of Danny Elfman and, of course, the Tim Burton Batman while we were filming, writing, doing everything here. So this whole sequence is just so very Burton, so very grimy. The factory set was one of the last things we built, and it was because I kept putting off how to make it look as cool as I wanted to. I thought like, oh, we'll Photoshop in a Trains thing, we'll do something else, but eventually we just made this huge this massive set with working chimneys and light up. I was so happy with the way it turned out. It looks just so cool, and it really captures the kind of, Tim Burton, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory-esque vibe I wanted to get. That set, that famous moon shot, was one of the few not shot by me. Well, it was kind of shot by me because, the crossing of the engines was shot by me on a green screen, and I had to light that individually. Oh, and part of the buildings, too, is also me. But most of that is Enterprising Engine 93, Matt Michaud's handiwork with the help of Psychic Jason, who he was filming that set with, and a lot of Alex buildings there as well, which just fits the whole vibe of Bad Influence pretty well. This opening scene, or not opening, but it's kind of the introduction to the Scarloey Railway, is kind of trying to establish the dynamic between Ivo and the rest of the engines on the railway. You can see they're very they're very comfortable and confident in their role on the railway, and Ivo, Hugh, they don't really know how to deal with someone because it's been so long since they've had someone new. And they kind of just expect that he'll find a role, even though they would have no idea what that role is. So because it kind of sets up the status quo of Thomas, and kind of messes with it, it's one of the only sequences that uses Thomas music. Every time I did use official Thomas music in this movie, it's because I wanted to set up a status quo that would later be kind of, messed with. Like the other time is the first Coldy story, right, which is told by Scarloey in the form of the parable that's kind of meant to teach a lesson, right? And then, of course, by the time you hear the actual story from Coldy himself, it's very different. It's got the cinematic music, it's got the score and everything. Speaking of music, you can hear in the background the building up of the Jojo Rabbit version of David Bowie's Heroes. I was a huge Bowie head when I was writing this movie. I mean, I still am, but to a lesser degree because I was just getting into him for the first time. And Heroes ended up being Ivo Hugh's theme, right? Which, of course, you hear later in the beautiful Peter Gabriel cover of Heroes. But we still never hear the actual full version of Heroes in this movie, which I had considered, but I think that will probably end up being for another time, if at all. But, Heroes is Ivo's theme, you kind of just have to think of it that way. That trestle bridge was all fully built out of wood and cardboard by me and my parents in summer 2020. Half of it was destroyed for setting it on fire in 2020, and then, of course, we came back to it in 2021, and eventually, again, this year, 2024, to film the creek scenes. So we had to just keep, salvaging more and more parts of the bridge that were destroyed over time, the second reshoot looks pretty good because half of the bridge is still intact, but, half of it's gone, so you couldn't film the whole thing. And then by the time you get to, this year, we had to kind of restructure some of it to save, the little tiny bit we have left to do the base of the bridge, which is really funny. But pretty cool construction work on that bridge, and a lot of hard work, a lot of wood glue, a lot of sawing. But, there in the back, you can see one of the melted retaining walls. Pretty funny. Yeah, this is a very 90s Ivo, which I think is, pretty apparent. He basically got to listen to the music of the time and the movies and stuff of the time because, it's in a modern era. They've installed the TV in the work shed while they've built him, right? So a lot of his attitude and his view towards the world, even though he hasn't experienced almost any of it, comes from his observation of human culture that he perceived in the works, right? That's the Spice Girls reference that he makes, later. This is a funny scene. I was pretty happy to be able to do a cutaway gag in a Thomas movie, and I think this ended up being perfect for it. that incline set is directly intended to replicate the incline set from the Magic Railroad parody Christmas special. Because I all the stone construction, all the actual like parts of that incline water tower structure and the incline building itself, which we don't see in Bad Influence, were all designed by me, hand built, and I sent them to Nikki for the Magic Christmas parody. But while he was filming them, I asked him to film a scene on them as well for the Bad Influence Christmas special, which meant that when we included the incline in this movie, I had to basically copy that exactly, which of course is funny because so much of this movie is like, you know, you look at the style of it and you can see Mr. Conductor Fan all over it. But that was the only time where it was like, okay, I have to directly copy and directly take it instead of just accidentally copying him, which happened quite a bit of times that I had to refine. But I do think it's really funny in this scene how Duke, you know, he chastises Peter Sam before he chastises Sir Handel. I don't exactly know why that is, because Sir Handel's just such a big, you know, he's so rude, right? But it's funny, it's just, it's not Sir Handel being rude that annoys Duke. It's not an engine misbehaving. It's an engine kind of stepping out of line, right? And Peter Sam is suggesting a distraction with I Spy. And of course, Duncan is totally against what Duke is kind of standing for, right? Because Duke's really just riding off that paranoia from the mid-Sodor, right? Like his whole method of survival involved on falling into a system, right? Really, his whole philosophy of just kind of being a cog in a machine is the same as James's. You know, Julie thinks of life as a play, but James's cynical view is that life is like a machine with replaceable cogs that he is one of. Duke knows this very well, and because obviously that actually happened to him on the mid-Sodor. So it's kind of an entertaining situation because James is such a big inspiration for Ivo and basically tells him to challenge Duke in the way that he does, but at the same time, Duke is kind of just echoing... James is just echoing Duke's rhetoric pretty much exactly in kind of just a different form. But, you know, it's all about whether or not you fall into a system that secures whether or not you'll be protected, because, you know, if you aren't serving that for that function as a cog, you have the danger of getting replaced, which, of course, happened with pretty much every engine that Duke saw in the mid-Sodor. But he survived. He stayed with the railway, but then the railway shut down. And he basically stayed with the railway through death, which is not exactly the place you want to be. So even though he kind of is honestly the newest addition to the Scarloey Railway, he kind of takes this patriarchal role in it because he's so used to being that on the mid-Sodor. But he kind of expects everyone to be on his side because of this. But in reality, you know, engines like Rusty and Duncan know that he wasn't there back then. And of course, Scarloey and Rheneas do as well. But, you know, a lot of the dynamic here is about whether, like, who was in the room when something happened, right? Like, the disconnect between Scarloey and Rheneas is largely because it's largely distanced because of the fact that, you know, Rheneas was gone so long and Scarloey had to take care of the railway, not only on his own, but then when he went to works, he had to kind of leave it on his own, and he saw all these new engines and he had to deal with them. So basically almost everyone that moved into the Scarloey and made it the fleet that it was happened while Rheneas was gone. So Rheneas can come in and act like he's the head of the railway because he was. But Scarloey also knows that he doesn't... Scarloey knows that Rheneas doesn't have the context that everyone else does. And, of course, everyone also knows with Duke, right? But Ivo doesn't. To Ivo's knowledge, Duke has been here the whole time because he presents himself that way. Yeah, in this scene with Ivo and James, it was also one of the last scenes that we shot with the Crovan's Gate Station because of the fact that we built Crovan's Gate Station so much later than the sheds. But you see the sheds in the background, even though, you know, I sent them back to Alex in January 2022, because that's all like this shot right there, all the engines in the back, that's all Photoshop, you know, that's all edited in. It's actually rotoscoped in if you look at the back of James's train there. But I had always had this vision of the sheds and the station as this huge, giant connected set, right? And I really wanted to do that. It's how I originally filmed the movie when I first built the Crovan's Gate set in 2019. That didn't look so good, and so of course we redid it all, but I didn't have time. We didn't have the time or space to fully build Crovan's Gate by the time we had to film the sheds. So I was kind of disappointed because I was like, oh, it's not going to work together. But in the editing, we managed to make it work and make it look like it was that one cohesive, consistent set that just kept going directly from the sheds into the station. So I was really happy about that turning out. And of course, that scene has an amazing performance from Andrew, the chairlord, as James. Really, that's kind of that first impetus, that first, bad influence, if you will, on Ivo. Even though, of course, that term has a lot of meanings that I'm not going to really get into here because I want people to be able to have their own interpretation of it. But there's also, like, Andrew added a lot to that scene, not just in performance, but there's some ad-libs in there, too, some references to some stuff, if you pay attention. As some people have pointed out, I did purposefully try to keep D261's face hidden from all the promotional material for this movie. Partially because I thought it would be funny if like people saw it and they were like, "Ooh, why is he hiding Bowler's face? Like, is he actually a different character? Is he actually something else?" Right? But then, of course, that reveal happens, and it's like, "Oh, that's just Bowler," right? But it's been hyped up so much by that point, you're thinking, oh, there's something sinister. There's something really going on that we don't know, and we're going to find out. But then it's just like, oh, he's just there, And that's kind of the same process that James goes through. So I think it works pretty well in that context. That passenger woman set of lines was the last thing vocally recorded for the film by my one of my college friends who's in acting as well. The original music there, that's music from Hollow Knight, Nosk, for the Nosk fight. It was originally music from Hollow Knight's sequel, Silksong, right? But my friend Garnet was like, no, this music's a little too pretty. It's a little too, just nice music, right? It was dramatic, right? But it didn't have the foreboding that the final music used, and of course D261 needed. So I was pretty happy with the way that turned out. This is, of course, another scene at Tidmouth with that dynamic lighting, and it was, not only did we have to match the faces lighting with it, we had to match the figures as well, right? And these were the figures designed by the wonderful Annie C., who did a fantastic job on these, mostly in the very early summer of 2024, this year. We all just kind of rushed the figure process, but it came to my attention kind of recently when I was rewatching it, just like how important a role the human characters play in this. Like we really did end up using the figures a lot, and I was pretty happy about that. So it wasn't just like she made all these figures just for them not to be used at all. No, they have a pretty sizable role, which I was pretty happy with. It was really fun to write Bowler, and of course to direct the wonderful Mr. MPS 2002 in these early scenes, because you don't really get to see who he is a lot, because you're seeing it all through James's perspective. And James, of course, is not trying to see Bowler at all, which of course plays into the fact that you don't see his face, right? Most of the time when you see Bowler, you're seeing the image of him, the silhouette of a diesel, and never his actual identity that has grown and changed and is nuanced and all that stuff. But these lines were fun because it's like, you can take them as genuine or you can take them as threatening. You can take them as something that's hiding something underneath, or you can just take them for what they are, which is how D261 actually feels about it, right? Like the way he talks to the passengers, which is his first speaking line in the movie, you understand that he actually cares about them, right? But then it's kind of obscured because then he goes into this conversation and there's question brought into whether or not he's genuine. The fumigated line seems like it could be antagonistic towards the standard gauge engines, but of course it's actually a dig at himself, right? But it's too early in their relationship for them to fully know that yet, or for the audience to know. So it's delivered with this kind of beautiful, sly edge that I think makes, his voice, like MPS did a great job, where it makes his voice just obscure enough to not fully be readable as to whether he has changed or not, as to whether he is, I don't want to say morally good or bad, but, there's a tease there, right? That Henry model of Old Shape Henry was done by Flying Pringle, Jacob Jarrett. It was actually that Henry was actually fully repainted. It wasn't just that one section, but to match it and make sure that it was correct, it was fully repainted. I think those arches on the side were, repainted too by Jacob. But he's got a flat funnel, but that's actually a 1994 rounded funnel Henry, but the funnel was sanded off to match the flat funnel Henry that I had been using throughout the rest of it. That's Dusty Marie 53 and a little cameo there. Yeah, that clock tower in the back is from the big Bentley breakout set in Cars 2, and I just thought it'd be fun to use it here. Not really a reference, just like using what you have. The Knapford stairs, which, have bothered me for the longest time because I didn't know they existed. I think there's a lot of things in this movie where it's like, I didn't know them as a kid. Like, I didn't understand them growing up, so I wanted to delve deeper into them. The narrow gauge engines in general, I hadn't seen a lot of. I mean, I knew of them, obviously, and I'd seen some season 4 episodes, but a lot I hadn't seen. So as a result, the Duke episodes for one, right? So when I was older, I watched the Duke episodes again, and I saw them, and I was like, wow, there's a lot of material here. So what sprung from that was from this movie. Like, this movie combines a lot of aspects of the show that I didn't know about as a kid. And of course, one of those aspects is, although very small, the Knapford stairs, which I discovered existed like very recently. So I was like, okay, let's include them. That Julie model, as many customs in this movie are, was made by the fabulous Thomas Wooden Models, Bo. And of course, over time throughout the movie, you can see it kind of get a little bit degraded from use. But, it worked fantastic for what we were using it. I wanted to include the red engine and be like, oh, people are going to think it's James. People are going to think it's James. And then be like, nope, it's not James. It's his sister. That's actually the Isle of Man in the background there, which I, kind of a go-to for me. I was always like, oh, if I want a good close coastal background, I'll put in the Isle of Man, because it captures that Sodor spirit so well. But yeah, I wanted to kind of subvert expectations by having, Julie and James be different people. You're like, okay, we're going into Flashback. We're gonna see James, but it's not James. It's his sister. There's this Knapford Station building itself was also made by Bo, and there's a little poster for Bad Influence on the book stall, which of course doesn't make sense when you see it in canon here at all, because it's before Ivo, literally 74 years before Ivo existed, but it's a nice little nod that I like. That shot with Hat kind of coming out of the smoke was kind of like, we didn't really get it fully across, but I wanted to do something Hitchcock-esque where you see the silhouette emerging and then you're like, it's Topham. I mean, the bigger question is how he basically teleported there, but I don't know. I think that's for the theorists to figure out, like a two Tophams theory, like the two Henrys theory. I like that scarlet coat line a lot as a compliment to the fleet, because then, of course, when James takes on her color later, it also becomes a compliment to the fleet. It's kind of foreshadowing the fact that James will have a place on Sodor, right? Even if he's constantly doubting it. That's Eric, again, as the yard manager, which was, he's super fun to write. I really liked the LMS staff because it was clear that they cared for their engines, but not in the same way that Topham does, right? Like, you hear the superintendent talk, and he's like, okay, here are my workers, here's their efficiency. They're good people, but they're here to serve a job. They're here to serve a role, a cog in the machine, as you will, right? The yard manager personifies them a little bit more, but he isn't too pressed about the fact that they'll be sold, right? And the whole reason for that is to amplify how much Topham cares. He goes out of his way to contact Mr. Brown to make a deal to keep James, even though Mr. Brown's like, I don't care anymore. He ran away, whatever. But, it was a very purposeful contrast to have, the LMS, the other railway, have this kind of very gray, very, how do I say it? Very industrial kind of brutalist look, and for the people who work there to have a kind of a very similar attitude where it's very much just like, whatever gets the job done. But, I was very happy to do that, to create the contrast with just how vibrant Sodor was and how much it meant to Julie. Because, like she says, you have to visit it to understand. And James hadn't until he escaped. This sequence also features music from Hollow Knight, the beautiful City of Tears track that just ended right there, which I think is one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written for a video game, or just in general. I think it just works so well with the context of the game. But there is kind of a reprise of that theme when you get to fight the Dreamers, and it's kind of this more triumphant but a little bittersweet and odd reprise of that theme. And I really wanted to include it in Julie's death scene, but it just didn't work out with the timing of it. And it would have been kind of weird to have one piece of music and then kind of just slide that in there. I think what we have is just fantastic, but if I had the ability to kind of restructure it, I would have tried to fit that piece in there because it just would have tied things around pretty well. Those Julie faces were also some of the very first things kind of conceptualized for the movie because of the fact that, Annie drew the original design for them, I think probably back in 2018 or 2019. No, it would have been 2019. But of course they weren't really designed until this year, I think it was probably like March when they were translated into digital, but I think they work pretty well for her. This whole speech that she's doing with the Hugo music in the background is very similar to Hugo. This is her kind of explaining her perspective, which I talked about earlier, which is this idea of purpose, right? This idea of purpose that ties in with her view of plays, right? Her view of narrative structure, right? Which is why the movie is shaped in that framing device. But, this is one of the bits that is almost directly ripped from Hugo. I say one of the bits as if I directly ripped a million different things from. This is the only real narrative bit that's ripped from Hugo, even though there are a lot of moments with it. But it is kind of funny because the previous time we've kind of heard this theme, this music, is when Duke's talking about his philosophy of what the railway is during that montage where he's like, this is the role that you're expected to play on the Scarloey Railway. This is the role that I play, right? This is the role that you play if you want to stay safe and you want to stay part of it. And of course here, Julie is using it in an entirely different way. And the great thing right in this moment is that she inspires him so much in this moment, but then boom, he's thinking about it in a cynical way again, right? He's taking this idea of purpose and twisting it to use this as motivation to basically be prejudiced against D261 and kick him out, right? Of course, it's funny because in Hugo, the idea of purpose involves machines and that kind of cog piece in it. But here it's very different. I used it as the kind of perverse way that James twists it to be we're in a machine, we're replaceable parts. And that's why there's the cog in the logo too, right? Like that's representative of James's POV. But in an original version of it, I used that cog metaphor. I used that part metaphor, which was taken directly from Hugo. And I thought, it adds more color to have that as a contradicting viewpoint that James can have to what Julie feels. So then the play metaphor and the dramaturgy entered the picture. So that cog that's in the logo is kind of a relic of a previous version of the movie that, it's still applicable, but it takes on a very different context. Before it kind of took on a purely positive context, and this it kind of is a little bit negative of a context. These shots are also relics of a time where there was a full-length Scarloey discussion scene at night, which of course was actually cut before we filmed it. So I filmed the whole thing for deleted scenes and so that I could intersperse it in this montage, but it's not there now. Of course, it ended with this famous Duke Moon shot. But by putting it in the montage, we get to have this wonderful Beatles chord after. Which is just short enough to pass by the copyright restrictions so it doesn't immediately get blocked. But, that montage was so fun to do. When Nikki first premiered the Magic Railroad parody in a theater in 2019, the first part of it, the opening montage to his movie after the flashback was set to Turn to Stone, and I was like, shit! It's like, because I had already written Turn to Stone into this movie. I was like, oh, God, I'm going to have to do it again. But, of course, in the final cut, it features that beautiful score by Ace of Trains, right? So I was able to use it here, and I was able to highlight the chaos of it by mixing Day of the Life into it. This got a big laugh at the theater, so big that no one heard Duncan's line after, which I think is also funny, but this whole sequence of, Ivo getting to understand what it's like to be a production assistant is basically, it's kind of one of the last scenes that we filmed. No, not filmed. It was one of the last scenes that we wrote because, filming, this was filmed 3 years ago, but in terms of the writing, it was one of the very last scenes that we wrote for it. And the main purpose of it, in the narrative, the main purpose of it is to set up the idea that you can respond to victimization and confrontation without full confrontation back, right? Which Ivo's just been told that's the only way to do things to make change by James. And Stepney here is basically teaching him a different way of rebellion. Stepney's rebellion is much more, I think, empowering for Stepney himself because, either he's been hailed as a hero or he's been sympathized for being a victim of scrap. And I don't think Stepney's really interested in either of those things, right? He's just interested in his railway, what his life is, and, his relationship with Rusty, which is, that's what his life is. Right? But Ivo's he keeps trying to get something out of him that he's never going to get out. And I think that makes this scene really hit because it plants the seed in Ivo's mind that he can resist in a different way. Which of course comes back into play later. Stephanie was also one of the last characters we casted as well. That's Cyber Rusty 99, who has a fantastic series that you should check out if you haven't, using Trackmaster and Tomy, with a lot of really great character dynamics as well. But the other purpose of this movie, the other purpose of this scene was to include a little bit of High Tide, which was the short that we produced in 2020, 4 years before the movie came out. That basically involves Ivo and Peter Sam going around with the documentary crew and filming mainly Scarloey railway engines for interviews. And so I kind of wanted to pay homage to it by working it into the narrative because it was very much a short that came from the teaser trailer. It wasn't in the original script. It wasn't supposed to really play. It didn't play a big role in the movie at all, right? Which of course you can see because it's only isolated to this one scene. But I wanted to show where it took place within the narrative because it obviously couldn't have taken place between before the opening, because that's the reveal of Ivo Hugh, and that's the first time he gets introduced to the Scarloey railway engines. So if you're watching this movie and you want to slip in High Tide, the order is, Act 1, and then you can start to see some of High Tide happening in the end montage. Then you'd watch High Tide, then you'd watch Act 2 and 3, even though this happens before the end of, High Tide, because of course things go south and we lose the camera in a to the bottom of the river, right? But yeah, I wanted to work it in somehow. And of course, I know some people are going to be confused by its inclusion, which is also why I have that little headline go across the screen, which is like Scarloey crew. Scarloey Railway helps out with a documentary crew. But I don't know. I think it works pretty well. It's like a Toad Sprite idea little moment, and we get to see Stepney through it, which I don't know if we'd get to see otherwise, and it becomes very important for Ivo's arc later in the movie. So I've been a big fan of that scene. This is also, I think, a cute scene because it shows Rusty's thoughts on the situation, which were originally done in a conversation between Stepney and Rusty. But this scene ended up being the one that we included over the Stepney-Rusty conversation because of the fact that we were able to set up the Godred in the Rubble bit for Percy at the same time. So it saved a little bit of time to cut the Rusty and Stepney interaction because, Stepney kind of implies their relationship, and we learn what Rusty's thoughts are about Ivo here. But I really like the interactions between, Rusty and the workmen here because it shows that it's a very tight-knit little railway and really highlights those positive relationships between, the humans and the machines. That shot was to kind of illustrate later that the Climax Cliff and Coldie Quarry were, they're on the same line. This was that the big shark line was a reference to Jaws, obviously, but originally Peter Sam was voiced by Parody, director of Unlikely Phantom, who's a huge Jaws fan, who's making a documentary right now about cruel Jaws. But he was the original voice of Peter Sam, which you can hear in High Tide, and he was recast, but I thought it would still be really fun to include this little nod to him through Peter Sam mentioning a shark, and then of course later bringing the Jaws soundtrack into it, which I think you'll hear when Ivo Hugh shows up a little bit later. This is great because you see Duncan and Duke like head to head here, and these are the two that most doubt the other. Duncan totally doesn't respect Duke at all because Duke is making all these judgments on himself and talking like he was there when Duncan was young. He was not there when Duncan was young. And of course, Duncan's rebellious nature, reminds Duke the most of his Mid-Sodor Railway pupils, or shall I say the engines that basically died or were sold off under his influence and responsibility. Of course, it's not really all his fault, but, I think it's interesting how much Duke cares about Duncan, because it's not just Duncan's threatening to, the system of the Scarloey, but it's the fact that people accept him, right? Like, Duke kind of has the leverage over Ivo because everyone's questioning of him, and he's kind of, not the best behaved, right? He keeps causing accidents. So Duke can kind of use that as, a reason to, he has everyone on his side, right? Whereas with Duncan, he's been established, right? Duncan does his job. He just goes against how Duke thinks the job should be done. So Duncan is really threatening to Duke because of that fact, and also in turn because of the fact that Duncan constantly is challenging Duke, where the others don't really bother, don't really care. Sir Handel and Peter Sam obviously grew up under Duke and, of course, have a favorable opinion of him regardless of their traumatic time on the Mid-Sodor. But, Scarloey and Rheneas, Scarloey and Rusty are really the only ones questioning Duke, but they're not saying anything, right? Whereas Duncan's saying anything. He's bringing Smudger up. He's bringing all these stories that he's heard up because he can't really bear to hear Duke act like he's been there the whole time when he hasn't. And basically Duke takes that, or anyone that tries to vouch for Duncan, as a traitor, right? As a threat to his... And there he is again, knocking Duncan. That scene is pretty poignant because it shows just how much offense Duke takes to the fact that Duncan is challenging him. And of course, it shows how serious he is about people that support those who... Because he's paranoid. He's paranoid about, something happened to mess up the railway, and Duncan is not easing him in that way at all. That little reference that Ivo makes to you know what it's not doing? Raining, like a little weather update. That's actually another reference to High Tide that I slipped in there to kind of punctuate when this took place. Basically, the end of that is it looks like it's about to rain. Let's get the camera back to shelter, right? Let's pull it off the bridge. But then, of course, bad things happen. Ivo charges at Duke, and the camera falls in the water and gets destroyed, right? But all that's because, it looks like it's going to rain. So when Ivo comes in, it's you know what it's not doing? It's raining. It's not raining, right? He's really pissed off because all that happened basically for nothing. And of course, he highlights Peter Sam because Peter Sam's the only one who could possibly know what he's talking about in that context, besides Duke. But he's very much not interested in hearing anything Duke has to say at this point in time. This is also very early footage. We used not all of it was, but some of that stuff is location footage from 2018 before Bad Influence had really been formed, because I was also planning to just do a Bad Lookout adaptation. And then that turned into literally adapting Bad Influence, literally adapting Bad Lookout into Bad Influence. Because this is all really old stuff. But what was interesting is when we filmed that Culdifell Curve set, the one that Godred falls off of. Well, first of all, we used the little zipper to a zipper to simulate the rack rail, which is a trick I also learned from Bo, which makes that look really good. But the first time it's told in this kind of very picturesque Sodor, this very sunny picture book looking, environment with that classic Thomas music playing in the background, as if it's just another Thomas episode, right? But the second time it's told, it's gray, it's dreary, it's cinematic. And it's funny because all that came about because that Culdifell Curve set was filmed in a day where it went from overcast to sunny. So I just filmed the whole thing, and I was like, okay, some of it's overcast, some of it's sunny. We'll put it together and it'll work out, right? Whatever I end up choosing. But we had enough footage that we were able to tell the story twice, with this cloudy stuff not being included in the sunny stuff and the sunny stuff not being included in the cloudy stuff. So you have two very distinct pictures of the same event that look and feel totally different from each other because of the soundtrack and the lighting. So, the way the day's weather changed really actually helped the movie in the long run. And this is kind of interesting because obviously Scarloey knows that it's a real story because Coldy's confided to him, but he hasn't confided to Rheneas. So Rheneas still thinks that it's a fake story. And I think Rusty knows that it's true because Scarloey's confided in him before he's confided in Rheneas. But, to Rheneas, it's still just a parable, just a story that he doesn't know whether or not it is true because he has no reason to suspect that it's fake or to suspect that it's real because Coley told him that it was fake, right? This scene is a beautiful creation of the transitionary scene. And by that, I mean that, I don't think the scene was on the outline for the movie when we wrote it, but it was we need this transition scene to show about how Percy's been kept up by this Godred story, and that further shadows that he will be, that he'll be late later because he's been kept up out of fear and worry and stress, right? He's got nightmares about the whole thing. But what came from the need to write that scene was this lovely interaction between between Percy and Bowler that I think again showcases Bowler's humanity. Like, he genuinely wants to help Percy get to sleep. He can't help that he falls asleep himself shortly after, right? And I think it's really cute because, again, Bowler does not get a lot of lines early on. I say early on, but really in the first, at least half of the movie, more like the first 2/3 of the movie, he barely speaks at all. And the fact that the few times where he does speak in a way that is truly genuine, truly polite, and we see that he's a kind and caring person, is in situations where James is not in the room. So, James does not see any of how he's actually helping Percy in this situation, nor does he see how he's actually talking to the passengers. He just sees D261 laughing and talking with all the people he considered to be his friends, and he just thinks, oh, he's wormed his way back in, This is, of course, a cheeky little reference to Tale of the Brave, which is, if people don't know, my favorite Thomas movie, which you can kind of tell from the way that James and Percy are in this movie, and of course for the landslide that happens later during the fire. But a part of this was to kind of also set the time period. I wasn't really trying to be like, oh, this is my chance of exposition, because Bad Influence kind of takes place in this alternate universe in the 90s. After the events of season 4 have taken place, and after the show has premiered depicting the events of season 4. But it's kind of a weird universe where season 5 and 6 are happening at the same time, and they're kind of being interwoven with various aspects of Railway Series canon. And one of those things is obviously Percy and the Haunted Mine, which in this reality happens before certain other things like Rusty and the Boulder, Toby and the Flood, that kind of thing. And same with Salty. Salty was originally meant to be in this movie because he was in that original Brendam scene with Bill and Ben that set them and the aquarium cars up. But because that scene was cut, he was also cut, which is sad because I love Salty. But I do think it makes it a little bit cleaner timeline-wise, because you're thinking, okay, it's season 5 era, right? Salty's not here yet, whatever. But then, of course, we have that little Percy and the Haunted Mine thing, which kind of throws everything off. But, you just kind of have to roll with it. It makes it fun. This scene, I think, is interesting because if you watch the movie, you kind of understand that everything causes the next thing. I think especially in Act 2. Because obviously, if Percy hadn't seen Godred in the Rock, he wouldn't have rushed to tell the Scarloey Railway about it. And they wouldn't have told that story if they didn't know that Ivo needed a lesson to kind of change his behavior. But if, it's because of them telling him that story that Percy stays up at night, and it's because Percy stays up at night that he makes James late. And because James is late, he doesn't get to take the children, which makes him angry, which leads him to the docks where he picks up the aquarium cars, and because of that, and because he gets tricked by that, he lashes out at Ivo, and because he lashes out at Ivo has that mindset going in, and of course he leaves the aquarium cars, and if he didn't leave the aquarium cars, he'd never be able to use the aquarium cars to help put out the fire at the end. So it's all just like a tapestry that just keeps being knitted closer and closer together. It just keeps unfolding. It's like a domino effect, right? I was about to make a Pee Wee Herman reference there to like a sweater that you just keep knitting. It's like you're unraveling a cable knit sweater that someone keeps knitting and knitting and knitting. And I just made the reference, so it's kind of cringe now. But the point is that scene, though it illustrates that Percy made James late because of the Godred story, James could have totally turned it around there. He could have totally made the choice not to be lazy, not to be preserving his role, right? Because he thinks, oh, Percy's going to shunt. I don't shunt. I take the train. Because I'm fulfilling my role, I'm doing everything I need to be to get what I want, to stay safe, to secure my position. But what that scene shows is that that's not enough, right? James has to do more. James has to be a good person. James has to take initiative. James has to do more than the base role of the society he lives in to succeed. It is because he does not take that initiative that he does not get the children. It's not that, oh, Percy's late, and so that screws James over. It's Percy's late, James screws himself over. Because the remaining events of the film could and may as well be possibly, very prevented if James had acted in that moment to collect his own train. But he didn't, and I think it's a pretty clear indication of character and a pretty good setup of later when James is able to, make that choice to take initiative and help save the day by helping Stepney get the aquarium cars. This scene, you may recognize where it was filmed. It was filmed near Brady's house in Ohio, where a lot of Enterprising Engine episode wharfs were also filmed. I shot this on the Shining Time 2019 trip with my old camera, which it's a little obvious in some shots, but looks pretty good in others. But I ran out of battery while I was filming this scene towards the very end of it. And it was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to finish it. And I was like, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. But it was funny because we filmed almost everything, except for a couple inserts that you see. But the last shot of Duke leaving, not here, but later after the confrontation at the wharf, that last shot of Duke leaving was shot on my phone because my camera had run out of battery. It's the one shot that was shot on a cell phone versus everything else being shot on a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, right? This, of course, has the fantastic Matt Mashad back as the clueless workman who doesn't get his ice cream, which was such a fun role to devise. It's funny because initially what Enterprising asked of me was like, oh, can I voice a workman who gets crushed by falling debris? That was what he told me. And so I just wrote that into the movie. And what comes from that is this hilarious character that literally dies by getting crushed by debris. I was talking to Matt about this earlier, and it was quite funny because he basically was like, yeah, me and Annie both asked for our characters to die independently of each other, right? Because Annie had also been like, can you... she didn't say like, oh, can you kill off Julie? But it was kind of the thing where it was like, please do this because Brady had said, oh, I'm finishing Southern Conflict. I'm, killing off all these characters, but I can't kill off Annie. People would kill me if I killed off Annie. So on my end, I thought, well, I know exactly what I need to do then. I need to kill off Annie. And Annie was all for it. But on the other hand, the other side of things, Matt was just like, oh, just make me a workman that gets crushed. And I was like, okay. Sure, I'll make you a workman that gets crushed. And I did exactly that. And it's really funny because his death kind of signifies a tonal shift because then we get into the flashback sequences of James at D261 and, of course, the fire, which are all really heavily toned. But that death of the workman is kind of the first, turning point to tell you, oh, anything can happen in this movie. Don't hold on to a vision that it's going to be okay because terrible things can happen. So I'm pretty happy with that, and I'm forever pleased when Matt suggests things to me, and that was just such a funny bit that we had to include it. Sir Handel falling into the barge was one of the last things we filmed as well. Of course, the barge scenes were filmed over the entire length of the production of this movie. I had always wanted to do Sir Handel falling into a barge. Part of it was because I didn't know what to do with Sir Handel in this conversation, right? He didn't really contribute a lot. I mean, Duncan was originally planned to show up at the end of this sequence, but I kind of cut that as well. Also, partially because I didn't film it, so I would have had to do an insert shot to make this work in context. But Duncan, to me, is just a little bit more interesting to work with in this dynamic than Sir Handel. Obviously, he has a lot, Sir Handel has a lot to do with Duke, so I think there's, stuff that you can play with there. But at the time, I was like, I don't know what to do with Sir Handel. I'll put him on a barge because of Matt's amazing Coldy Fell movie, where he has this video that he posted separately where it's like Coldy's river raft adventure, where Coldy falls down the mountain, lands in a Lego barge, and just goes down the river with like a GoPro attached. I thought that was the coolest thing I've ever seen. And then he did it again in Sudden Conflict, Fortunate Son, where he had like a Lego boat going down the river. And I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. I need to have engines going down the river. So, that was my little indulgence in this movie, was to have Sir Handel on a barge for I don't know how much of the runtime, but very fun little bit there. Again, Duke just mad for no reason about the fact that people tried to talk to Duncan because he sees Duncan as a threat to him. So anyone who talks to Duncan is against him. Very, very silly little goofy guy. Scarloey to me was an interesting character because he's just constantly pulled between Rusty and Rheneas. Rheneas is his roots. Rheneas is his core. That's what the Scarloey Railway was to him. Like, it was him and Rheneas together. They knew the railway. They looked after the railway. Typically, Rheneas is who Scarloey agrees with, right? But in this case, there's that distance, and he's aware that Rheneas was not there for any of these engines when they were new, right? He didn't see any of this. And so, of course, he's being kind of pressured by Rusty, like, oh, yeah, you agree with me, right? You agree with me. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, I do. And I don't want to make Rheneas mad, but yeah, I agree with Rusty. And I think it makes it pretty compelling because you can tell that Rusty, Rusty's pretty quiet, but he cares a lot when he notices something. Like, he spends all day maintaining the Scarloey Railway, and as a result, his job is basically to notice things, little things that are wrong, or things that could go wrong with it, and that expands to the social aspect of it as well. And, of course, it's in Scarloey's best interest to listen to Rusty, because Scarloey cares about his railway, right? Like, you see how devastated he is when he hears about the fire. But Rheneas Rheneas doesn't approve of Duke's methods either, as you can see. But, he's more, involved with preserving the system of the Scarloey Railway, whereas Scarloey realizes, because of people like Rusty pointing it out to him, that there's something going on that is deeper that needs to be addressed. This scene was originally a lot longer. There was more Duke lines within it talking about like how he specifically had tried to help Ivo. But it was significantly cut down because of the fact that we just had to we only have so much time and we kind of want to make it concise. But I'm pretty happy with the way that with this scene, we got to film a whole sequence within the work shed, because Alex had done these amazing, he had wired these LED lights inside the shed, and it was like, well, by God, we have to use those because they look so cool. And as a result, a lot of this involves the gauge scaling, right? The digital gauge scaling, right? Because the standard gauge are visibly bigger than the narrow gauge tracks, which incredibly we were able to do even within that small of a set. You can kind of see how big Duke is in the background there, but I was very happy to be able to use all sides of the Crovan's Gate set, including, areas that aren't used as much in the actual show, which is why we filmed that last little Scarloey apology scene behind the shed, right? Because that back area is literally only seen in, I think, is it the character bumpers, right? With the little name boards, the post van name board is shot back there, and you're like, what is that? And then you realize, oh, it's the back of Crovan's Gate sheds, which is never seen in the show, which meant let's use it in the movie, right? So it was really fun using these very very kind of different locations in the movie to be able to highlight them. With Coldy, when I first filmed those scenes in 2018, I did not have additional Coldy models, right? So what I had to do is I had to film it as if, with the intention of splicing it together in post to make it look like there were more than one, even though I was just using the same model, right? And so that's what ended up happening here too. Godred and Coldy share the same model, albeit one side has the Godred nameplate and the number, and one side is, obviously just the basic Coldy, but all the scenes with them together is just pure VFX. It's pure VFX. There was never more than one Coldy on my set at the same time. It was literally all just, more than one Coldy fell engine, excuse me. It was all just the same model that we copy and pasted several times, except for, of course, Arthur the LMS's models, which look kind of different from the rest of it, but it was fine. I think it really made it pop. You get the idea that there's 3 or 4 Coldy fell engines that look like the wooden Coldy exactly, and then there's a couple that have that kind of, sloped boiler shape a little bit more heavily, which are the customs that Arthur the LMS engine made. That sequence with Godred falling off the cliff also was like a lot of filming in a lot of different locations over multiple years, but it never ended up happening. But in the original telling of the story, not this more dramatic one, I wanted to have you peer the shots in there of Coldy peering off the cliff and you see Godred way down below, but I wanted it to be even further down. I wanted him to seem even further away and have a little puff of smoke, where it's you like in a Looney Tunes cartoon when you look down and you see the little puff of smoke. Well, it's kind of there, but it's very subtle homage that wasn't fully realized, but it was always kind of the vision. This is, of course, Coldy just fully foreshadowing what will happen with the burning bridge later, which this is another kind of bit that we didn't really get to fully follow through on, was the idea that the bridge would be rebuilt. But, you can kind of assume that because they burnt out that foundation of that bridge, which was already getting pretty old, right? It was already getting pretty crooked. They'll be able to rebuild it and make it stronger, which, of course, is what ends up happening with Ivo and Duke, right? But, it's really funny. Me and Lemmy started this ongoing joke about Coldy because he really is just trauma dumping here. And, of course, later when he talks to Duke and Ivo in the epilogue, Ivo doesn't know this stuff. He's really just trauma dumping again to a kid, which is hilarious. That little newspaper insert I also did pretty last minute during post-production because, it doesn't really ring super, apparent. But if you pause it, you can see that it mentions, Duke being found and, of course, phrases him as a newcomer to the Scarloey Railway. I wanted to put that in there because if an outsider to the Thomas fandom watched this movie, I wanted something that mentioned that he was newer than the others, because he acts like he's the oldest one there. And I wanted to show in some terms that he was not. He was an outsider, and Scarloey knows this because Scarloey is the real oldest person who was there. And again, Scarloey, like Rusty, is noticing everything. That's one of my favorite little Scarloey moments in the movie, is that just side glance at Duke. Just a lot of really subtle things with Scarloey that he just doesn't say out loud, and that I think is kind of what makes his character. This was, I don't know how many times we filmed Wellsworth. Wellsworth was another of those sets that just kept being rebuilt so many times. I think that was the last time it was built, because, the other stuff had been filmed outside, but that was done inside to get that sunset effect. But this argument between James and Julie is truly what shows their philosophies, truly at odds with each other. But this moment was not this was not the original placement of this moment in the movie. Originally, this argument happened within Act 3 during the sequence wherein, during James's flashback sequence, right? He's like, okay, one day I got relegated to the back of the shed, and then I lashed out, and then this scene would have played, right? But in context, it dragged on way too long. It made that, the flashback sequence is already like 20 minutes, and it's just a very long sequence as part of the film, and this would have stretched it out to another 5 minutes. It would have made it so much longer. So, a good friend of mine, John Gunnell, Steak and Cake, suggested that I slim up that flashback sequence, right? And so one of the ways that I was like, okay, here's how we do it, is by moving this scene to James's lowest point, right? Because, in present day, James has just been told not only that he did not get to take the children to the carnival, but that D261, his arch nemesis that he wanted to get the job to take the children to show that he was better than him, got the job instead. So it really can't get much worse for James, even though it does. So this scene shows where that anger goes, right? Which, of course, we see exactly where it goes when we see him talk to Ivo later. But this is kind of like to show, like, I think this placement really ends up highlighting how just nasty James becomes, like how nasty he can be when he doesn't get what he wants. And it's not just as if he had this perfect sister that he lost and that he had this wonderful relationship with her and that's why he feels bad. No, he was rude. He was very much an asshole to Julie. And I think putting this scene in the middle of Act 2, or not in the middle, but towards the end of Act 2, not only reminds us of his past with Julie, but also shows what he is capable of when he is in these low points, as well as being able to help split up the movie so that there is a little bit of James's flashback in each act, because originally Act 2 didn't have any. But in this way, we get to tell the story piece by piece until we have that last little moment, In the background, you can hear a little bit of the opening to Quicksand by David Bowie. Originally, there was a longer montage here, which just showed all the engines sulking that was set to Quicksand. That original shot of, D261, not D261, I don't know what I'm talking about, of Duke, like, puffing home after he talks about, like, his routine, like, during that introduction sequence. And he goes past Renana's station, he crosses over the river, and there's like that side pan with the sunset. That was originally meant for the Quicksand montage. But it was at that point that I realized, okay, montages take a lot of work. The Turn to Stone montage involved so many sets, so many different actions, so much going on to fill that time and tell the story in a quick manner to the music, right? And in this case, it just would have been useless padding. It just would have added not only too much to the movie itself that just didn't need to be there, but too much to the filming schedule. And I was like, I'm not going to fill this out just to show characters feeling bad, because we already know that they feel bad. And we know what happens when they feel bad because we've just seen James yell at Julie about it. But I still included it as transition music because I love David Bowie. And I thought it would be fun to include that. This is, of course, the... that's funny. I was just looking at my aquarium card yesterday, and I was noticing that the octopus is kind of stuck. Like, he doesn't float around in the water, and I was wondering if he looked like that for the movie, and he did. He's already stuck by the time we filmed this. It's funny because, Ben gets the big speaking role here, and then Bill's in the background, but when I filmed this scene, I actually only had the Bill model on me. I had to film this very much last minute during one of my summers before I had to go back to school. And I was like, okay, I got to film this. I'm just going to do the same thing I did with the Coldy models and film Bill twice and Photoshop it to look like Ben. So every time you see Ben's nameplate in that scene, know that it is digitally inserted by me to reaffirm to you that it is Ben and not Bill. When in reality, it was just Bill. Ben gets the big role in the movie, but Bill, I guess, was the big actor behind the scenes, if you want to phrase it that way. This scene is probably my favorite in the entire movie. I often said to myself, if nothing else, I'm making the movie to get to this scene, right? Like this was the driving force there, like this scene needed to come out. This movie needed to come out so that the scene could come out. Because it's just so wild. I think it's so, almost no dialogue is said. And I think it's so powerful despite that. The most we hear is Ivo's exclamations as he rises into the sky, which I think are just incredible. And, I think it's incredible because of Peter Gabriel's Heroes cover. I think this is just fantastic. Originally we filmed Ivo staring at the barrel in 2019, which became one of my favorite shots ever. I was like, this is what Bad Influence is as a shot. The shot isn't even in the movie, but it's in high tide. And of course it became this amazing scene. I don't know. I think the thing to think about here is how freedom is shown through this imagery of flying. Because it really is just like the ultimate freedom, especially to engines that are, basically restricted to rails. It's about as grounded as you can get. So when Ivo starts levitating, it's very much a mirror of how Julie recognizes how beautiful the bird flying is. Because she can't fly herself, right? So when Ivo flies in his imagination, it's kind of really symbolic. And of course, Duke is in the cage and opens the door because it's like, okay, Ivo, get in the bird cage. But Ivo doesn't go in the bird cage. Basically, Duke falls through the trap door of the bird cage, and as a result, Ivo lets Duke out of his cage. Sure, Duke is bringing Ivo back down to the ground. He's removing him from this beautiful dream of freedom. But at the same time, Ivo is letting Duke out of the birdcage. So I think it kind of works in both ways. One of those last shots, the big one where Duke and Ivo are like falling through the clouds, was actually the last shot where the visual effects were edited, because I just kept putting it off, and I was like, I don't want to do it. I really don't want to do it. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to make it look good. I had done a test of it, and I was like, oh, well, this is okay, but it doesn't look as good as I want it to, compared with the rest of the scene. And, one day I was talking to Nikki, Mr. Conductor Fan, about the movie, and he kind of, because I had kind of helped him very last minute on Magic Railroad Parody, I did a lot of the visual effects for the actual Magic Railroad scenes themselves. I did like Lady puffing through the clouds and, Thomas coupling up to the gold dust truck inside the weird void. Because I had helped him with that, he was kind of like, is there anything else you need visual effects wise? And I was like, not really. I was like, I'm basically done with the movie. Everything's basically finished. But then I was like, oh, wait, I still have that one shot that I keep putting off that I've not finished. And so I thought, you know what? You can have it. And the funny thing is that, again, it's engines falling through the sky, which is the same thing I did for him. So I think it's a beautiful little bookend, not a bookend, but, it all comes full circle, right? Because I had really kind of come of age watching and working on Magic Railroad Parody. And then, of course, he ended up helping out on that specific shot in Bad Influence. I think it's quite poetic, really. And I think it looks pretty good. Again, like I said, I'm just a huge fan of that scene. This is, of course, James at his most jaded, which is just fun to write, and it's fun to watch, and it's especially fun to hear Andrew voice act. I thought it was funny how the aquarium cars basically were the cause to basically bring him to full frustration, because I've seen so many people just get so worked up over the aquarium cars that I thought, like, it's really funny if that is the reason for James's mental break as well. The station master is voiced by Garnet, who also voiced Henry. But that was just a fun little extra role that I wanted to give them. This was a rough scene to put together because I don't own Ada, Jane, and Mabel. I borrowed them from Alex to film these shed sequences, right? And then when I sent the sheds back to Alex, I sent the coaches back to him as well. But the thing is, we still had to film the station, right? We had to film, Ivo pushing the coaches up to Peter Sam. We had to show the coach's wheel sparking so that we could set up that she would later, develop a flat wheel and cause the fire. But when I went to film the station, I forgot to ask for the coach's back. And I was like, oh my God, I forgot to get Ada, Jane, and Mabel back. And this is the one chance I have to do to show Peter Sam puffing away with the train. So what ended up happening is I ended up having to borrow them after the fact and green screen them in. So that last shot of Peter Sam puffing out of the station is full, like that's him in front of a green screen with the coaches. And just barely it works, but it was a close call, and I felt so stupid for not having remembered that I had to ask for Ada, Jane, and Mabel again, and just ran out of time with the station set. Mabel, of course, is voiced by one of my very dear friends from school, Annabelle O'Neill, who I literally just recorded these lines for in 2 minutes on my phone. I was like, okay, do this, make some out of breath noises. She totally ad-libbed that scream as well, but it was a fun time. It was a good time. There's the Pizza Planet truck in the front with so many other references in this scene alone that I can't even begin to point out. I think the Batmobile from Burton's era is there as well. There's some additional Cars characters. Jambalaya, Chimichanga, the Batman Returns duck. And there is actually, if you look closely on the carousel, there is a poster for the aquarium. And it was just another case of wanting to have foreshadowing for the eventual aquarium that D261 is helping build. That, of course, James suspects is some kind of murder doomsday weapon, But, in the opening, that's why I have Boko go past with the aquarium cars that are the old style, and then Duck goes past with the aquarium cars from Mattel. Just a lot of aquarium foreshadowing throughout the movie that's extremely subtle, but I had a lot of fun with. Those town shots with the expansive buildings in the background were shot by Alex as well. The first set was done in, I think, 2021, I want to say. Maybe it's 2022. I don't remember. So all this was 2022, but when you see him pull up to the phone booth here, that is literally from May of 2024. So, again, something else we filmed over a long period of time. I was so happy that he had the Ertl Mini James because I really wanted to show, James's spotlight getting kind of threatened. And that was my way of doing that. And it just looks great. It looks just so much like James. It even looks like the damage on it even looks like the damage you would find on a wooden James. So I was like, that's the one. It's so classic. It's so iconic. It's so cutesy. That a Chinese dragon too from earlier was also built by Bo. And it also fully lights up. I think it's fantastic. One of the best items I've commissioned. Because I was planning to do a Thomas Percy and the Dragon remake. I don't know why. It was one of many remakes that I had tried to do early on when I was still trying to make content like a normal Wooden Railway user. But, I never ended up making it. But here it is in the fair. So it looks great. And I can't complain. And I wish I had gotten to include it lighting up more. But it looks good. So I'm happy that we got to include it somehow, even if it wasn't the star of something the way it was originally intended to. The scene with Toby and James which is, I mean, it's over now, but part of that was to highlight James's disconnect with nature, which of course you also see with the first James and Edward conversation when he tells him that D261 is coming back. You know, Edward comes in and he's like, oh, you know, it's a lovely day, the birds are singing, and James is like, the birds, I don't care about the birds. Because again, he's just trying to repress what happened to him. He's trying to repress that connection to Julie that he has, the birds. But of course he's genuinely not doing that consciously, he just isn't listening, right? So whenever James was on screen, I very purposefully tried not to include ambience with bird sound effects. It probably didn't work out. There's probably some that slipped through. But the point of that opening to Act 3 is to be like, okay, the birds are singing, Toby shows up, he hears the birds, but then boom, it's suddenly quiet. And then James shows up and you understand why. Very subtle thing that literally only I care about, but it was fun to do. And I love Rusty's face in that little cutaway gag. Just the animation of that Christopher Birtwistle Railway Sparrow did of Rusty just like bouncing his eyes back and forth was amazing. And I also keyframed that the light inside that building to perfectly like bounce with the downbeats of thunder. It sounds like a lot of work, but it was really just fun. At that point, you're really just doing it for fun, and I enjoy that moment a lot, especially because later you actually hear Thunderstruck, which of course is basically ripped from Planes, Fire, and Rescue, like a lot of this score. I think the score itself. No, this is Batman Returns, but there's some score later that's just directly from Planes, Fire, and Rescue, a movie about a forest fire. And, I was very inspired by Planes, Fire, and Rescue, even though I wasn't really, like, into it when I was writing this movie. I was just like, fire, forest fire. And then it just ended up being so much Planes, Fire, and Rescue. It's very Planes, Fire, and Rescue. It's very Hugo. It's very Batman Returns. It's very Baby Driver. It's a lot of things, but it's never any one thing. You know, I had someone at the premiere ask the question, like, what was this inspired by? And I couldn't give a straight answer because there's too many things. It's a combination of everything put together in a big mixing pot, shaken around by me, and I guess I poured a little gold dust or something in there that I just was like, okay, here's a shark and an octopus as well that you can have in there, and now it's good, right? That's what bad influence is basically. Yeah, the reason Duke's looking down at the ground here is because he's realizing that what he said to the waterfall in the beginning of the movie is not true. He was like, we're you can't really change, we're getting old. We're like the mountain of time, we're not gonna. Nothing about the two of us, himself and the waterfall, is something he thinks will differ. But then the waterfall dries up, so it's like anything can change, and I think that, I don't want to say that's a turning point at all for Duke, but I think it's an interesting moment because it shows that he is capable of change as well, because nature has just basically destroyed that waterfall. So theoretically, the same thing could happen to him. And I think he's quite afraid of that, but of course in the end it ends up being a net positive for him. But kind of a fun little moment to write. Because, again, it has no words. So it's literally just something that comes across in the direction. But something that could very easily have been lost in the edit if I didn't make it a priority. I like to think that the workman who approved, the workman that Ivo references that approved Mabel being coupled up to the train besides her brake still being on is the same workman who accepted the ice cream bribe and later gets crushed by fallen debris. Of course, that's not in the movie, but I like to think that it's the same guy. Just because, This is, of course, the site of the aquarium, the structure that would become the aquarium, which is super fun. I also got to play a lot with coastal shots in here. This is this is stock footage that I used for the cloudy ocean here, but I did film certain shots of the actual ocean when I was there. I mean, I had to like protect the camera because it was actually raining outside. But I was able to kind of combine the combination of stock footage and actual footage. This scene was actually originally filmed at the coast. Like we filmed the whole scene on a cliffside ledge, but the structure just didn't look good, and a lot of it was just during the day. It wasn't really atmospheric like the final scene ended up being. So I was very glad that we reshot it, but there is always something to be said about filming on location. There's that barrel again. I think at this point that barrel becomes a symbol of freedom for Ivo, because he's that was the first thing he imagined flying before he saw himself flying. So I think in this moment where he thinks back to that, the barrel is in an odd way this vessel of liberation for him, which I think is kind of pretty funny, but it's also pretty cute and I think pretty powerful at the same time. It's also a red barrel like him, because red is a pretty important color. It's all about the spirit of it, that spirit that both him and James have that you don't want to erase. Well, obviously Duke does, but this is just a gorgeous moment. I think this is one of my favorite moments in the movie. Probably the last scene that was written for it. I think it just says so much about both Scarloey and Duke. And I think the strength of Scarloey's whistle is very important. Because Ivo just kind of gives a normal whistle. But then Scarloey's is just loud. It's just bombastic. I think it really sells the emotion of that scene really well. Which is why I used it again in the credits to signify his character, because I think it's such a powerful symbol of hope, This set was filmed actually at a local, I don't know if it was, I think it's a national park, called Silver Falls, near where I live, where some of the other waterfall inserts in the back were also used and filmed. But it's funny because we filmed the whole scene here on location at a park, and it blends perfectly with the trees in the back. But then it was really funny because this is a story I told at the premiere as well. You could start to see a bit of haze in the air when I was filming it, and I was like, I didn't think much of it. The next day I filmed Brendan Docks, and it starts to get a little hazier, and I'm like, okay. And then the next day I wake up, and it's like orange outside. And I'm like, okay. We're living under an actual fire. Where I lived, there were not close forest fires, but there was enough smoke in the air that it just totally diluted everything around it. It totally made everything look washed out, hazy, orange, red. And having that experience made me realize, I need to film these scenes differently. I can't just film them outside in the day, the broad sunlight, and add fire effects and maybe a little bit of a filter and have that work. I need to do this on controlled sets. I need to do this with the very specific fire lighting that we ended up using in this latter half of the movie. But what that means is that there's a whole additional extra, real, I don't know, real is stupid to use, but there's the extra half of that scene with all the engines fighting the fire, the dual gauge yard that was filmed on location, that of course we never used. But, initially, we never ended up showing it, but initially what was supposed to happen was that water tower during the middle of the James and D261 flashbacks, when you see Duke and Ivo kind of rushing to get away, and then, the Coldly Quarry dynamite blows up. That water tower was supposed to be shown falling over, right? And so then the next time you see it, it's on the ground because it's been toppled by by the trees. But initially that was supposed to be a turning point in that montage, but we didn't end up being able to use it because we didn't have footage from that, a section that had controlled lighting. We didn't, there was no middle ground, right? That James D261 was filmed in 3 sections where it was like, this is broad daylight, this is the haze when the fire's getting closer, and this is like full after the dynamite blows up. It's all over, right? It's fully dark, fully red, just like the smelter's yard, the same kind of like heat under pressure. So we didn't have that, it has those 3 stages that show the progression of how the fire gets closer, but we didn't have that for the dual gauge fire yard, so we weren't really able to include the scene of the water tower falling over. Also, I don't think the shots from that initial shoot of it looked really good, so probably a blessing in disguise, because you can kind of just infer what happened. I think James's pride in his paintwork takes on kind of a different thing in this movie because of how connected it is with Julie. It's both his pride, his identity, and something that he feels he has to be responsible for. He's basically stealing her originality and her spirit, but at the same time, by doing that, he's keeping her alive, and at least that's what he thinks he's doing, and he feels the responsibility to do that. So really, that red paint is the facade that he cared about his sister, right? It's the facade that he is a unique individual that has chosen this, and, it's a complicated thing, but I realized pretty early on that he didn't have a lot of moments in the first half of the script where he's talking about his paint. So I had to include that little insert where he's like, talking about his paint under the little impending rock slide that's coming. And I think it worked out pretty nicely because it helps foreshadow what happens later with his choice, This is one of those sets where, it was shot outside, so that's just the actual sky. We filmed outside with the sky backdrop lots of times, but whenever you see the sky in this climax scene, it's just the actual sky, which I think is pretty funny. That's just the sky outside. I also played around a lot with camera angles in that scene that just finished. I specifically wrote down in the script at what lines I wanted to do an above angle and like a below angle, because I really wanted to harness the power dynamics that take place in that. Because it kind of goes from being like, okay, we're filming James from above, we're kind of looking down on him, he does not have the power. And D261 always has those lower angles where it's like, okay, he has the power. He's the one that we're focusing on. But then, boom, you flip it at the end and it's like, okay, James has all the power. He knows the truth. He knows the story. And D261 is just on the level. It was really fun to play with, okay, now they're on the level. We're filming them at an even keel. Now D261 has the power. Now James doesn't. Now it's flipped. Now James has the power. D261 doesn't. But, I don't know, that it was just flexing my my film literacy knowledge to do that, and it was just really fun to do. I'm waiting for someone in the comments to tell me what that background I used for that newspaper scene was. Behind the newspaper. Yeah. I'll just say that it is from a piece of Thomas-related media, but one that is very kind of more of a niche personal thing for me, but it was really fun to be able to slip that in there. Yeah, that's where the argument would have gone originally, but now it's moved to the to the second act, where, of course, I think it works much better in both the flow and the information that it gives us during that time. The argument with Julie, I think, is another one of the strongest pieces of writing because it came later in the process. I really wanted to avoid accidentally doing the dead wife trope with Julie, right? I mean, obviously she's his sister, but, it's very easy to fall into that trope of writing, dead women as these figures of enamor, these figures that people adore and look up to, and when they're gone, it's like, oh, the focus is bigger on their grief, on the character's grief for that character than it was on that character. But through that argument, which of course is now long over in the movie context, but I'm talking about it now, I was able to show Julie's own agency and separate kind of who she was and what she wants from just being the source of James's grief, So I was pretty happy about that. That shot of Julie with the rust on her magnet, that's actually Scarloey's magnet that had actually really rusted, which you can see in the other shots of Scarloey in the movie, but I photoshopped those two together to show the idea that her couplings had started to rust, which worked out pretty well. I think the LMS superintendent and the yard manager are interesting because it's very clear that they care for their engines, but unlike Topham, they're very specific about how they refer to the engines. Like, they're like, okay, like, you're the best workers we had. And it's the same way. The reason I bring that up is because it's the same way that Duke refers to Ivo when he validates him for the first time. He's like, oh, yeah, like, we need more little workers like you. Because he's referring back to the idea of the world as a machine. That whole scene is also pretty interesting because of the fact that, it's basically Duke validating Ivo, and Ivo feels happy for the first time because he gets that validation, because he doesn't want an escape route out, right? He wants validation, but because he's not getting validation there, he realizes he needs to leave. When he gets that validation from Duke, he kind of runs with it, so he's not disappointed when he crashes. But then when he finds out Duke was lying to him, it all kind of goes to shit. So, kind of a funny little moment there. I mean, really, this is just me being more Burton again. Like, I really wanted to kind of get the Gotham feel down with this. I mean, there's even a nuclear waste thing. Not really relevant to anything, but we kind of based the factory buildings that obviously this is constructed out of on that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory remake that he did, and try to get the intricacies of some of those designs that almost kind of look like they're smiling at you, which is a signature thing of his. This scene to me is pretty, like, it was one of the scenes that I thought about cutting because I was like, well, it's just her making a decision on where to turn. It's not really that interesting. But when you think about it, that kind of needs to be there to set up when James turns to go the other way, because it's like, okay, this is the way that she's choosing to go to get to the factory. And she thinks this is the right way. It's going to be okay. This is our new future. And of course, it's the worst possible choice that she could have taken. But she doesn't know that, right? Because, for all intents and purposes, that leads them to their destination. They just don't know how bad their destination is going to be for them. So when James escapes, making that choice to go left instead of just to go back where he came from is clever because it shows that, it shows that James realizes that he can't go back to his old home. But he can't, stay there and get scrapped. So he has to make a choice to do something new, and that's the choice he makes. And ironically, that choice is the same one that he makes in the climax of the movie, where he chooses to go left and follow Stepney and be active and kind of forgo his pride and forgo all the baggage that he has surrounding his paint and surrounding Julie to, save the day. But it's that same choice of a junction. The biggest two choices that James makes in the movie are the first to go to Sodor, like Julie had said, by turning left at that junction, and the second to follow Stepney into immediate danger and risk his paint getting sooty to save his friends by turning left at another junction. So that's why I ended up keeping that James and Julie turning at the junction scene in there, even though it wasn't really needed. It was needed. I don't know why I'm saying that. I worried that it wasn't needed, but when I put it in there, it was needed. So I was glad about that. It's funny, in these Smelter's Yard scenes, I tried to sneak in some Cars references in here. You can see on the side there, that's a Cars vehicle. It's one of the Road Rumblers, which is, short from Cars on the Road. But, at the time when I filmed the Scrapyard exterior, I was trying to basically sneak in a Road Rumbler wherever I could. So if you look carefully, you can basically find every single Road Rumbler that they made in diecast has a cameo. Every single one has a cameo in that movie. You just kind of have to look out for them. I think there's... How many are there? I think there's like 5 or so. 5 or 6. But they're all there if you look for them. That is the final instance of the Julie back-end disappearing motif, which was how I chose to film her a lot, because it's always been something that's, I guess in a way, it's kind of tied to myself, because I feel like I when I was a kid, I used to have kind of these nightmares of being, like, abandoned. Not necessarily, like, fully abandoned, but just kind of this idea of, like, someone you care about or you're with is just a little bit up ahead of you, but then something happens that keeps you from reaching them. And so you basically have to watch them get farther and farther away from you, and that's kind of the horror of it. So I always enjoyed filming Julie that way because of the fact that I knew that James could never quite reach her. She was always someone that James followed, but could never quite catch up to. And in the end, of course, he has to watch her drive away while he's stuck on that siding, and then to her death. So the last time we see her alive is, of course, that same vision of her just slowly drifting away from us, the camera not moving. We can't catch up with her. We can't reach her until she's gone. And that is, in turn, echoed in, I think, the third to last shot of the movie, or maybe it's just the second to last shot of the movie, where James watches D261 leave Chance leave for the winter as well, and we watch his back end, and of course Coldy as well, just disappear out of focus. But that shot is meant to represent James kind of coming to terms with people leaving him in that way, because he's had this trauma with Julie the same way. It's, of course, very ironic that the last thing Julie sees before she dies is that Sodor crate that's just haunting her, that idea that there was a better future for her, and as much as she wanted it, she couldn't get it. But when James sees the crate, further along in the shed after it's been passed down to a different crane, it's able to act as that source of hope for him. It is able to enable him to make the choice to go to Sodor because Julie told him about it. It's his only option at this point. So again, I really like what Sodor symbolizes in this movie, and it's a big symbology for James. Up in the corner there, you can see another version of D261, and there's a couple sprinkled throughout this chase sequence. There, you can see them in the corner right there. Those are basically previous attempts at D261, right? Because, we find out eventually that there were many versions of him, many versions of the different types of diesels that had been made all around him, but he basically grew up believing he was special because he was spent so long, they spent so much time tweaking him and stuff, but he was not the first one, and he was not the last one. but they kept him around to work, and it's only after he realizes that he was betrayed and never really loved that he's able to see all that. But there's early hints of it in that scene. There's a little Mr. Conductor figure there on the platform. It's very cute. This was just a lovely excuse to use Casey Jr.'s theme because it was in the Dumbo soundtrack that Danny Elfman did. And because it was sandwiched by another piece of Dumbo soundtrack, I was like, well, we got to use this. We got to use this to show James discovering Sodor. I think what my goal with this sequence was to eventually show him making that same journey that Julie did, when she first got the passengers from Henry. So his first move, of course, is going across that what do you call it? The past the little gristmill, the little bridge past the gristmill, and then he climbs up the hill to see that same exact view that she does from before. Of course, we don't need to see it because we've seen her see it. But in so doing, he also puffs directly into the image of Gordon that he saw on the billboard before, which I think is also pretty clever. I'm just gassing myself up. When I say something's clever, don't listen to me. I'm telling you, I forget things that are in this movie. So when I talk about them, it's kind of just me remembering them because it took 6 years to make. Just now, by mentioning Gordon in that billboard, I'm remembering the fact that, Ivo flying over Gordon in that earlier flashback scene is basically just to show that, obviously, Gordon is what Ivo dreams of because of what he's heard the narrow gauge engines. The narrow gauge engines first phrased, open line freedom to him in the form of Gordon. So the fact that he's so far above Gordon doesn't even hear him, and Ivo doesn't even really care because he has that full freedom in that dream. I think it says a lot. That's myself doing the voice of Thomas there. We had a little in-joke because the first person I cast as Thomas was Wiley, and that didn't work out very well. And the next person I cast just, disappeared off the internet. So we joked that the Thomas role was essentially cursed. So I guess now that I've done Thomas, I have about, 7 days to live. So we'll see how that goes. That LBSC Thomas is, of course, also used in the Magic Railroad parody, very briefly in the opening. But, a lot of the custom usage in this movie was how can I use these more, right? Because I think this is the most screen time that Eric's James got. It was in an episode of his series, which is great if you haven't seen it. But I just really wanted to give it the spotlight in this, and I think it really shines through, even as it got a lot more, weathered over time. That shot with Thomas and James puffing past the hillside as the sun sets is the same exact shot. I mean, if you've seen the movie, you know that it's the same exact shot that D261 and James pass by, after D261 pushes James from the what do you call it? From away from the landslide, right? He saves him from the landslide. But the reason that is the same shot is to indicate that in both moments, that's James being rescued, right? Both moments show a new sense of freedom and connection that James builds. It really meant a lot to James, I think, that Thomas rescued him, and thusly so did the whole of Sodor, because they rescued him, they welcomed him in, and he's kind of lost sight of that throughout the movie. He's just really clinging to how possessive he is over his role, instead of his previous gratitude for it. But when DT61 saves him, he has to change. He has to change a lot to be able to process and accept that, and I think that brings back that sense of gratitude in him. And I think that's the reason why I chose to basically shoot both of those shots on the same set, even though they would in no way be the same location in reality. That's purely a set that exists not on a geographical map, but in an emotional headspace, Going back to this like Tidmouth set, there was a couple interesting things that we did with it. As I was using the deluxe roundhouse because I liked the way it looked, but I was like the red doors don't give Tidmouth. So as you can see, I hand painted those green myself. I left the windows, but I painted the doors green, and I weathered the stone to make it look a little more like a real building and not like a toy. And that's of course the season 4 good shed and not the season 1 or Tatmar Onwards one. There's a lot of really lovely ad-libs that Andrew makes in the movie. I think, like, just that one, like, that little issue was an ad-lib that they made. But, the took them on as my own, like, taking my sister's colors on as my own line was fully them as well. They added a lot of just pathos to James and his relationship with his sister that I think is incredible because it's in the script, but they built on it, you know what I mean? Like the lines that are there, they did, but they translated them in such a beautiful way and basically transformed the way James spoke. You know, they took lines that were good and made them, in my opinion, quite excellent. By either like changing the phrasing a little bit or just taking a few little pauses when they felt it was appropriate, or even just adding new lines, you know, like I said. But it's just such a strong performance that you really just kind of have to marvel at it. Because I had originally kind of coached them to do it with a little bit softer of a Scouse accent. But as it turned out, it just ended up devolving into this James voice, which is, you know, I was worried it wouldn't have range, but it does. So I'm pretty happy with it. That shot is also pretty incredible because it is not just rotating around the engine, but rotating around the digital train face. So it's a combination of the physical camera moving and the digital camera moving and having to stitch them together to make it look okay. So it's definitely a shot I'm pretty proud of. But yeah, I think Andrew's performance here is just impeccable. Again, another, like, they're on the level. James has the realization. Boom! He's in the position of power again. Pretty sick. Yeah, this is where the water tower shot was supposed to go. These shots were literally just me experimenting with a camera slider for the first time because I don't know if I had just gotten it in, but I had bought it. Those were some of the first shots I filmed with it, you know. There's the payoff to the setup of Rusty dropping off the dynamite at the beginning of Act 2. This was definitely one of my favorite scenes to film and to edit. I mean, this was kind of, the exterior of this was filmed very recently in June of 2024, but the rest was filmed in, I think, January of 2022. But I just absolutely adored filming the smelters. The lighting and the smoke that we were able to get with all of them was just, I think, impeccable. I also think that the figures look amazing, or should I say mainly the figure of Mr. Brown looks great here. It was just really fun to like put him in all these different positions and see what he looked like with the contrasting lights. That D261 model of old shape D261 basically is what I was calling it, was also designed by Jacob Jarrett. And basically its goal was to make Diesel 10 if he looked like D261. The original goal for that was different because I had planned to do something else with Diesel 10 in like a mini series. But as a result of making it the base for D261 in these flashback sequences, I show that I'm kind of trying to illustrate that he was already planning what would become Diesel 10 that we see at the end. And I also just think it's kind of interesting because it shows like how much Bowler was experimented with and changed with over time. This Spin and Fix Thomas set that we ended up using for the workshop, it was really kind of just a lucky guess that it would work. Originally, we planned to do like this really long elevator, this really tall elevator for D261 that would be like powered and we'd have it going up and down, but we didn't have the time to 3D print or, really motorize that. So it was just kind of like, okay, what are we going to do to replace this scene? And then I was like, oh, Spin and Fix Thomas. And it's funny because when you spray paint it, it genuinely looks like film level quality of industrial prop. You'd never guess it was, the Trackmaster set unless you were in the fandom and you knew Thomas merch, right? So, I mean, obviously a lot of people are going to recognize it instantly, but I think some people aren't, and that's kind of exciting. I think that set is my favorite that we did in the movie, because it was just this combination of the Spin and Fix set, the industrial walls, the large like circular window design with the steam that would come through, and the wood planks for the flooring. I was trying to, I mean, you can kind of see with the color grading too, because the original scene was more like yellow, but the goal of this was to replicate the workshop in Spider-Man 2, where Doc Ock is, building his like whole contraption. I mean, I think it even has a kind of a similar, what do you call it? Big like circular metal contraption in the middle. But that's why the 25 is there. That's replicating the outside of that warehouse building, pretty much exactly from the movie. Same thing with the wood planking. But I just love it. It was a really fun homage to do, and it worked out incredibly well. You get to have so much fun with the fact that he's fully a pet, he's fully like this total piece of machinery that's just like twisting in all sorts of shapes and contorting himself in all kinds of bizarre upside down positions just for, this guy, just for this inventor. This pan is also pretty darn cool, I think. That's my little explanation of D261's number. Because I mean, initially he would not have been. He would have probably been like Diesel 8 or something like that, building up to Diesel 10. To be honest, but I remember early on I had this idea of like. Not this idea, this kind of debate with myself of if Mr. Brown should talk. I think maybe in some versions of the script I had like a scene where you have a conversation between him and D261, but in the end it just worked better if he told the whole thing. And it also speeds up the time by a lot. But I think having, Mr. Brown as this voiceless figure really aids in how ominous he is. Just as I think that having D261 appear throughout so much of the movie as a faceless figure really harrows in the fact that we don't learn who he is until much later. This shot of his face here is pretty much the last of his face that we see in the flashback until he discovers the shed where all the diesels are being scrapped, right? Basically, from this point onwards, Mr. Brown stops seeing him as a person, so he stops seeing the face, right? And that's the same thing with James. So, all these shots of him are filmed from behind. He's in his new shape now, obviously, but that doesn't mean anything because he's, at this point, literally just a faceless diesel. My mom put like different colored liquids in the little vials, which you can't really see super well on camera up there, but it was super fun to have like these different like tanks of toxic waste at the top. This shot of, I think the claw passing by right here was originally intended for that end credits montage where we reveal the claw and Diesel 10, but we had to fill time a little bit in this montage, and it felt just like the right thing to do because then you set up what the truth is like much earlier. I think it's also interesting here because you could start to see more of the scrap. Like if you look at when James and Julie originally arrived, there's barely any scrapped engines around. But the moment Julie shows up and Ari and Bert scrap her, it's like, ooh, then suddenly you see the corpses of the steam engines. And it's the same thing here where it's like you don't see a lot of scrap around and then boom, all the diesel corpses at once. And then, of course, a previous version of him, right? Which I think is pretty pretty haunting, especially because it's the exact same model that was used for D261's old shape. I think the weathering from Jacob helps a lot too. I think there's Hodge from Chuggington in the background somewhere there. I think Andrew might have also added the "That Haunts Me" line. Again, just really impeccable understanding of the character that Andrew had when I gave it to them, and just was really happy with how that turned out. But it's funny because as a result, we spent so much time talking it through and just working on the lines that I think probably about 5 hours of raw James lines that I had to sort through to edit this movie because of how much time we spent not just talking about the character, but literally like so much of it is just Andrew doing like bits in the James voice, which I think will be fun to. I mean, some of those will come out in the bloopers video if I get around to it, but it's quite funny. You'll just have like a section of 10, 20 minutes. It's just us talking about like a germ a bit. And then of course it goes back to the lines, but it's kind of a lot to sort through, but really, really funny stuff, especially because so many of those discussions were, they involved the James voice. This was another scene. I mean, I talked about how I shot the Climax bridge like multiple times and, we had to kind of rebuild it each time. This was the first time, right? Obviously you can tell because it was during the day and the bridge is, mostly complete. But at the same time, all those like shots of the waterfall and the creek were shot that final third time. This is the third time. It's just the base of it with the creek, the river underneath, and the waterfall. But again, another set where it was like, I don't know how well the green screen is going to work. Then boom, it does. So I was very happy about how that turned out. That's actual fire there. I mean, I don't want to say how much is real fire and how much is fake fire, but a lot of this is a combination because we really did set that bridge on fire. This whole really this sequence of events with the bridge collapsing really couldn't have been done in any medium other than wooden railway. Obviously, I chose Superstation track for standard gauge and just stuck with wooden railway for the narrow gauge to kind of create that differentiation between the gauges, but it worked out really well because you can't really do the same thing with just the track piece falling and like falling out of place and just like falling down that you can in wooden railway. I think this movie, as much as it is a celebration of the characters, it is a celebration of what you can do with both wooden railway and trains, I mean, because obviously I wanted to include the digital faces to show, how far we've come with that and the animation that we can do with that. But that climax literally cannot happen in any other medium than wooden railway because, for example, like the bridge jump doesn't, like those shots of the track falling doesn't work if it's not wooden railway. And, the bridge jump that happens where, Duke lands on that extra little section of track doesn't work if you're not doing wooden railway because, wooden railway naturally catches the engines. Obviously it wouldn't work in a world where they have to land on actual rails, but with a wooden railway, that's actually physically possible. So, big wins for wooden railway. This movie would not be possible without it in more ways than one. This music is from The Goonies, which was filmed in Oregon, not necessarily near where I live, but it was a big part of, I guess, my inspiration for filmmaking early on. And it has this gorgeous, like, scene with the pirate ship underground that just is kind of left out. Let out, sorry, not left out. And there was a cut scene with a huge octopus that was in that room with the pirate ship. And I guess I must have been thinking about it when I was doing the aquarium car stuff with the octopus, because I was just like, oh, what if I use some music from the Goonies here? And it's beautiful. It worked out perfectly. Now, this music I just love. I think Social Network is just one of my favorite movies of all time. And this, oh my goodness. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, I really can't get enough of their score. It's so simple and yet so utterly unnerving and haunting. And I think this sequence is about as close as we get to a horror movie in Bad Influence. And it just makes you want to do more. Like, I remember this moment with the Stanley interspersed cut was quite literally a jump scare moment for the people that watched it at the premiere. The shots here of the mid-Sodor engines that are punctuated in the background where you see like what happened to them, I think is pretty cool. I mean, I would have done more of it, but it was also just a time thing, and I wasn't bothered to be like, because, you know, not all these engines actually died. A lot of them were sold off, but like Albert and Tim kind of got the worst of it. Well, obviously Smudger / Stanley got the worst of it. But you know, originally this was a much longer flashback sequence attached to this, not with a lot of dialogue. It was still a montage. But this, I think, was the way to go because of just how unnerving it was. It doesn't give you a lot of context, but it tells you that this is far from the first or second or third time that this has happened to Duke. And that's pretty haunting, I think. I think what makes that scene also, besides the music and the thematics of it, is Nikki's performance. I think that is probably the one of the best performances of the movie. I think definitely the best section of Nikki's lines, even though he does a great job as Duncan. That is literally like we sat there and we had him do the lines for the mid-Sodor engines so many times. Like, I think I used almost all of his different takes for Smudger and put them together so you hear Smudger echoing, and then all those like you know, we basically devised a personality for each of the engines one by one. So it was like, okay, this guy we're gonna have be you know, kind of like an Irish. We're gonna have Albert be Irish. We're gonna have Tim be like, we're going to have like Jennings be like posh British. Then we're going to have one that's a little more cool toned. Then we're going to sprinkle Smudger back in there. And then, of course, that final voice is just utterly cool and calming. It's just Nikki's raw voice yelling at Duke just for his paranoia and for everything. And really, it's comforting him in a weird way because Duke got what he wanted. Duke got what he wanted. All the other engines left the railway before he did. He basically ratted them out to save himself. So that he wouldn't get kicked out of the railway, and it worked. You know, he saved himself, he saved Peter, Sam, and Sir Handel. They all stayed on the railway, but then the railway closed, and he was stuck with it. He stayed with the railway, but at what cost? Everything, right? And I think those ghosts haunting him, all being voiced by the same person, Nikki, who kind of, honestly, let's be honest, sounds a little bit like me, is really kind of... I think it's a fun little artistic choice, and it was really fun for me and Nikki to kind of test his range and see how many different engines he actually could voice, and you know, and make them different while doing the same lines. That's Real Fire again, more Real Fire, not Real Fire. It's really funny. This shot actually, you know, they stopped before the end of the shot, so I had to digitally move them like a PNG across the end of the shot after the tree falls down to make it work. This sequence was also a lot longer, but it was cut to make sense with the time. I wanted to do this large falling like boulder thing, but it was just like there's just so much going on in this climax already. We can't really muddy it anymore. I kind of want to, at this point in time, I kind of want to take us back to the Stepney thing, because I'm remembering that what Stepney says in that interview of just like, what I like is I just like those days where I'm on the open rails. It just feels like it's me, myself, and the track. And that's what Ivo says he likes too. So in this scene, I basically have him narrow his focus down to just him, himself, the track, and Duke. So in that shot where everything goes away, like the smoke and the sparks go away, that was all done in camera, by the way. There was no visual effects there. But this void, that is him locked into the track. The same thing that everyone dismissed earlier, that's what allows him to save Duke. And of course, it's what he basically was about to forget, because he became preoccupied with everyone else's thoughts about him, preoccupied with trying to rebel against them. But Stepney kind of sets that back in his mind when it was really his goal the entire time. And, what ends up saving Duke. I got a really loud cheer from the audience at the premiere when the bridge jump happened. And, it was something that I was always kind of a little bit like trepidatious about, because, there's been so much discourse about, bridge jumps in the fandom's history, which was part of the reason why I put it in. Same thing with the aquarium cars. I wanted to kind of challenge. I wanted to challenge a lot with this movie, which I think is quite clear. But, I wasn't sure what people would think of the bridge jump. But when we watched it, the whole room just erupted. And it was at that moment that I realized that no matter what I had done with this movie, like, I don't know, like, whatever it is, people were on board with it. And that was a huge... It was really something that's been gratifying throughout this process, is realizing that no matter what I had changed drastically, people were willing to try to understand it. And I think that's really all I can ask of this movie in essence. But the bridge jump was just fun to film. I mean, I was like scared that I would get electric shock from touching the smoke machine when it was like getting wet, because I was fucking filling up the puddle so much. But it was really fun to film though. Another cutaway gag, I think this is one of 3. Bad Influence really at its core is just like Family Guy. I was really trying to make a movie that was so Family Guy funny moments that no one would have to watch Family Guy funny moments in the theater. But, I know this movie's boring as hell, so I'm sure someone did it. But this scene is pretty good because, both Duke and James basically tell the others, like, I'm going to let Ivo tell it. Like, I've been speaking the whole time, but I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to fight for this person's voice to be heard, which I think is really important to show how they grew throughout this whole thing. It is a bit odd that DJ61 didn't join Stepney and James here, but I think it's probably just to have a standard gauge engine, on helping out at the base while they did that. James remarking on the soot here kind of harkens back to that idea of why the sad story of Henry is even in this movie to begin with. Because this is James's big choice. This is James's kind of climactic moment to show that he's grown, to make this inactive choice to make this active choice versus the inactive easy path. And, this is the opposite of what Henry does, right? Like, Henry's whole reason for hiding in the tunnels because he doesn't want his paint to get ruined. He's hiding from the world. He's hiding from the rain, and he gets shut up in the tunnel because of it, right? And Julie has to take the train for him. But in this moment, James almost has a similar situation. He has the choice to either hide in the tunnel and basically, kind of undo a lot of the progress that he's made, or he can keep going, keep facing what bothers him, and use it as a way to help the people around him. So I think it's again one of the very last things that we wrote for the movie. I think probably because it involves Stepney. But it's crazy how so many of the big character moments, like what Stepney means to the film and what he means to Ivo's arc and what he means to James's arc, were so late in the process. I think it's because once you get that outline down, you can start working on the little details that really help the arcs feel clear. So that scene ended up being great because it helped justify why the sad story of Henry was in the movie as well. This is a lovely little reprise of the Portacorsa theme from Cars 2 that Michael Giacchino does that we used to open the movie. But again, with now we're back at Crovan's Gate again. Here's the theme again, but it's the theme from the end of Cars 2 now, so it's changed a little bit. Yeah, I struggled pretty hard to find good images of like a fruit splatter. I was like, if I had fruit on me, I could do this, but I didn't, so I just had to kind of make do. It's pretty funny that this movie. I mean, I've always been pretty skeptical of the people who kind of treat Edward as if he's like this perfect, kind, almost kind of like a god figure in Thomas. But it's pretty funny how this movie literally has an Edward ex machina, where Edward just shows up and then suddenly the the conflict with the fire is kind of averted. But I've been pretty I've laughed a lot thinking of that, but I think it works. Again, you'll notice the tensions between James and Percy are kind of bubbling over in this scene. And I think it's probably because Percy just Percy just got cleaned off from the accident that James caused by switching jobs with him. uh. I think this is just a really sweet moment. I had always thought about the name Chance for him. Someone asked at the premiere if I had had any other ideas, but I really hadn't. It was kind of always Chance. And, at a time, I thought that the movie was like, I said like, the movie's about second chances, right? Because it has, that fear of like, will Duke get a second chance, right? Will Duke get a second chance with Ivo? Will Chance get a second chance, right? Will Coldy get a second chance with Godred, right? And it ended up being something that was a big part of the themes, not necessarily the primary theme, because I think there's a lot of stuff baked into this movie from different angles, but Chance was always there. It was never like, we're going to call him like Brad or Barry or something like that. It was always Chance, and I think it works pretty well for him. I like it a lot. This is that scene I was talking about where it was like, we had to use the back of the sheds because, we actually constructed them, and it would be weird if we didn't use them because the show didn't use them. And that's kind of weird and messed up. So we got to use them here, which was a lot of fun. That scene with James and the bird, I think, is also a great little bookend because, it's the same. Well, it's not necessarily literally the same bird, but you can kind of think of it as that spirit of Julie that's kind of haunting James throughout the movie that he finally just lets go in that moment. Because it's like as if he doesn't really need her to help shape his life anymore because it was influencing so much of what he was. And in that moment, he can kind of just let it go, which I think is pretty cool. Although I have to say, like, finding different angles of that bird footage was a bit of a struggle, but it worked out though. Yeah, this scene kind of puts the cap on Ivo's arc. They had always tried to. It was always that they had apologized to him. That was always in the script. But the importance of focusing on how he chose to accept their apology was what I really targeted in the rewrite. because it's only in this moment that that Ivo finally like kind of says, I don't need your validation, James, which is such a big deal because he needs validation from everyone. He's always searching for it. But in this moment, he's like, no one has to understand me. No one has to validate me for me to be who I am and enjoy that. Like, no one has to, you know, not only does no one have to understand me for me to keep being who I am, it's also like, I don't have to conform to what other people are saying to be successful, right? Like, I don't have to be angry. I don't have to rebel against everything I see to be happy. You know, like, I can be like Stepney, and it's okay if James never understands that because I'm not trying to be him anymore. Like, who he is not someone that's a role model for me anymore. So it's okay that he doesn't understand. You know what I mean? It's the same thing here with him and Coldy, where he kind of, again, is like, you know, you don't have to take the guilt of Godred on yourself because, again, Godred made the chance to show off in the way he did. It's the same way that Percy isn't responsible for James being late. James is, right? And I think, in a weird way, by the end of this movie, even though I think I'd probably argue James goes through the more radical change, Ivo is still more mature than James because he's still, you know, he's realized that he doesn't have to fight. You know, and James, he's still got a little bit of that fighting spirit in him, you know, which, of course, you don't, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's pretty funny because I don't think you can ever make a story where you fix James. Like, that would be wrong to the Thomas DNA. You know, you have to keep some aspect of his character, his pride, his rambunctiousness, his kind of ignorance in there if you want to do James. So with Ivo, it's kind of like I can change him because his whole arc is within this movie, right? Like, you know, like he didn't really exist as much of a character in the Railway series. This is my take of him. I've basically made him as an OC, so he can grow tremendously throughout the movie. Whereas James, it's kind of like, you know, to keep him as the character we all love, you kind of have to hold back a little bit on it. But it's still fun because, you know, all these characters, there's always more to learn from them, you know? This whole montage was also, this ending monologue was much, much longer. But I cut it down to the bare essentials, and I think it works much better. Yeah, there's that end shot of D261 puffing away, and you just see the back of him and Coldy, and James has to watch that, process it, and then he can be grateful again, you know? But, yeah, I thought it was much more compelling to end the movie with a thank you than it was to end with the longer monologue that was intended to happen. Which means, you know, there's a lot of footage that was kind of cut from the ending, but we worked some of it into the post-credit scenes, like the whole Chance taking Coldy back and then he sees Godred, which, you know, that's what this scene is here, which was actually filmed at Annie's house, which I'm sure some eagle-eyed people spotted already. But you'll notice that Godred and Stanley in the flashback have the same face, which was very intentional, the same way it was intentional to have the mid-Sodor engines with all Nikki's voice. But I won't necessarily say what that means, because I think you can kind of go a lot of different ways with it. You could either take it as Duke projecting onto Coldy with Godred, or, you know, maybe he sees Godred's face and thinks of Coldy's story, or maybe he sees, you know, Godred as Stanley. I don't know. I think there's room to play with that there. This ending scene with the logging locos was planned, I think, from 2018. It was whenever the Sir Handel plotline was introduced, that so too was that end credit scene. But the funny thing is that we didn't film it until I think Monday before the premiere. So that was shot. I mean, I don't know when this is coming out, but it was literally shot like 5 days before the premiere. One of the very last things filmed. No, it was the last thing filmed. I don't know what I'm saying, but very, very last minute that actually came to be. But I'm so glad it was, because it caps off that story so hilariously, I think. these credits backgrounds are just amazing. They really fit the style of the poster and the logo that were made so long ago. But Annie really freshened that theme up with these backgrounds. Yeah, I mean, that's bad influence for you. I mean, I think I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I think there's like a lot of stuff in there that it would take like multiple commentary tracks for me to fully really get through. Like I've said, like I think you could make like a paper on like different aspects of this movie. Like you know, you could do like one on Ivo's form of rebellion versus James's form of rebellion. You could talk about how like Duke and D261 parallel each other, or how Ivo and D261 parallel each other, or how like there's a lot of that idea of like machine versus nature, like the cog versus the play idea versus, you know, the fire, even though they are all machines. But really at the end, I'm just glad that I was able to release this movie, because it was a lot and it took a lot of time, but it meant a lot. And I think I was able to connect with and work with a lot of great people because of it. As you all see them here. Not credited, of course, is the wonderful bouncer that we had at the premiere event, Joshua, who showed up with Enterprising, and we literally had him running lights and managing the crowd the whole night. And so I just want to give an extra special thanks to him, because he didn't end up making it into the credits because it was so far after the fact. But big ups to Joshua, and of course to everyone else who made this movie possible. And thank you for believing me, supporting me, helping me out every step along the way, and getting me to this point where I finally get to share it with everyone. So I'm excited to hear what you think. I'm excited to hear if any of these insights were exciting to you, or if they were really boring, if you hated them, if you hate Thomas and Friends, if you hate Diesel 10, if you think I should have just made a Beatles biopic again for the 79th time because they won't stop making those. I really just, there's one coming out in like 2 days. What am I supposed to, like, why is it, there's so much Beatles, there's so much Beatles material. I don't even know what to do with all the Beatles material there is in the world.